Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into the Naqshbandi Sufi order. And, they might seem like just another Sufi group on the surface, but there's been a lot of talk about some of their, beliefs and practices being a little bit out there.
Yeah, some would even say controversial, like really raising concerns even within the wider Sufi world.
That's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We've got these excerpts from a website. It's by Sheikh Mohammed bin Shamsuddin, and it's basically a pretty sharp critique of the Naqshbandi, their history, key figures, and really getting into what makes their path so different and to some, so troubling.
What's interesting about this critique, though, is it's not just pointing out differences. It also digs into why these differences matter in the context of traditional Islamic thought.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with their origin story. They claim to trace their lineage all the way back to Bahauddin Naqshband, a 14th century Sufi master from Bukhara.
And their name itself, Naqshbandi, which translates to engraver or pattern maker, kind of gives us a clue right away about their whole approach. They emphasize deeply embedding the remembrance of God, within the heart.
It's interesting how a name can be so meaningful. So they're all about that interconnection with the divine. And they've definitely gained a following over the centuries, becoming one of the most widespread Sufi orders in the Islamic world.
That's right. But when we dig deeper into their history, we start to see some pretty extraordinary claims about Bahauddin Naqshband himself. Claims that some devout Muslims even might find a bit hard to believe.
Like what? Give me an example. What kind of stories are we talking about here?
Well, there are accounts of him experiencing what's called fana, a state of spiritual annihilation where you basically merge with the divine.
Wow.
There's even an anecdote about Bahauddin spending 7 years, yep, you heard that right, 7 years deferring to dogs in the street as a form of extreme humility.
7 years with dogs. That's a long time to be hanging out with canines and merging with the divine. That sounds like, I don't know, maybe stepping on some theological toes, right? I can see why the author might be a little concerned.
For sure. And you're right, the author sees these stories as potential exaggerations, possibly even suggesting that they might be straying from the core principles of Islam. Remember, the Islamic tradition emphasizes a clear distinction between God and creation.
So this whole merging with the divine idea, that could be seen as, problematic from a traditional Islamic viewpoint.
Exactly. And this leads us to another pretty controversial claim made by the Naqshbandi, their insistence on having a direct spiritual lineage from Abu Bakr, the first caliph.
Oh, I see how that would give them some serious credibility. But is the author buying it?
Not really, no. He argues that this claim relies heavily on the concept of spiritual transmission, which didn't really become a thing until centuries after the Prophet Muhammad and his companions.
So is the author saying that this lineage is, made up? Are they rewriting history to make themselves look more important?
That's kind of the implication here. The author seems to believe that this claim lacks historical evidence and is maybe a way to legitimize the order's practices. It really makes you think about how crucial it is to really examine those historical claims, especially in religion.
Absolutely. Legitimacy is a big deal. Okay, so we've got these kind of eyebrow-raising claims about their founder and this contested lineage to Abu Bakr. But what about their actual practices? What makes the Naqshbandi stand out from other Sufi orders? I mean, in terms of what they actually do.
Well, they've got this set of 8 guiding principles for their spiritual journey, which they call the 8 words.
8 words. That's a pretty concise way to sum up a whole spiritual path. I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What are these 8 words all about?
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our look at these potentially troubling claims about the Naqshbandi Sufi order based on the critique we're seeing in Sheikh Mohammed bin Shamsuddin's website.
Yeah, we're trying to understand, why some of these practices are raising red flags, even on other Sufis. So let's get back to those 8 words that guide the Naqshbandi path. What are they all about?
Well, some of them are pretty common Sufi practices, like dhikr, the remembrance of God. But then there are others that have caused some controversy, like rabita, a type of meditation where followers visualize their sheikh.
Well, visualize their sheikh. That sounds pretty intense. What's the problem with that?
The author argues that this practice could be crossing the line into idolatry. You see, Islam is very clear about the worship of God alone. Focusing so strongly on the sheikh's image, that might distract from that central principle.
So the author's saying that this could shift the focus away from God and onto the sheikh, which is, well, problematic from an Islamic perspective. It's like they're replacing one form of worship with another.
You got it. And it raises questions about, the balance of power and whether this veneration could become, excessive. And this concern about excessive veneration, it connects to another controversial aspect, the Naqshbandi's emphasis on absolute obedience to the sheikh.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. It's one thing to respect your teacher, but the Naqshbandi seem to take obedience to a whole other level. What are the specific concerns here?
Okay, so the source mentions this anecdote where Bahauddin Naqshband asks a disciple, would you obey me even if I commanded you to steal? And the disciple hesitates, obviously. He brings up Islamic law, and Bahauddin basically says, well, if you won't obey, then don't follow me.
Wow, that's hardcore.
Yeah.
It seems like blind obedience, even if it means going against Islamic teachings. You have to wonder if that kind of power could be abused.
That's the author's point. They argue that Islamic principles should always come first before any human authority, even a revered sheikh.
Makes you think about that line between guidance and control. Okay, so we've got these controversial practices like visualizing the sheikh and this extreme obedience. But the source also talks about some beliefs that are just, well, strange, really out there.
Yeah. There are some truly bizarre claims attributed to the Naqshbandi. Like there's this idea that the Kaaba, the holiest site in Islam, physically travels to visit certain Naqshbandi saints.
Wait a minute. The Kaaba goes on a road trip, like packs its bags and hits the highway.
That's what the source is claiming is a belief within the order. They even quote a prominent Naqshbandi scholar, Ibn Abidin, who talks about what to do about prayer if the Kaaba happens to be, well, away on one of these visits.
That's wild. I mean, the Kaaba is a building. It's not exactly known for its nomadic tendencies. The author must think this is completely nuts.
Oh, they do. The author sees this as a total fabrication with no basis in Islamic scripture or tradition. And it's not the only outlandish belief. They also talk about stories of Naqshbandi sheikhs having supernatural abilities like knowing what people are thinking and even bringing the dead back to life.
Okay, now we're getting into X-Files territory. Mind-reading sheikhs and zombie revivals. This is starting to sound less like Sufism and more like a comic book.
The author sees these as pure fantasy, stories designed to inflate the status of Naqshbandi figures and create an aura of, well, awe. They argue that these stories have no basis in reality or Islamic teachings.
So it seems like the author is building this case, using these beliefs and practices, as evidence that the Naqshbandi have really strayed from the core of Islam. But what's the verdict? Do they think the Naqshbandi are a legitimate Sufi order, just with some, let's say, unorthodox views? Or are they saying something more serious? Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been going through some pretty surprising claims about the Naqshbandi Sufi order, and, well, things have gotten a little strange, haven't they?
Yeah, we've seen how the author of our source here, Sheikh Mohammed bin Shamsuddin, is really laying out his critique carefully, highlighting what he sees as their, deviations from traditional Islamic teachings.
Right, from that questionable lineage to mind-reading sheikhs and the Kaaba going on vacation. It's been a wild ride. So let's get to the point. What's the author's final take on all this? Are they saying that Naqshbandi are like a slightly offbeat Sufi order, or is it something more?
Well, the author doesn't hold back. He's presenting a pretty strong critique, arguing that the Naqshbandi have gone way off the path of authentic Islam. He points to everything we've talked about, the exaggerated claims about the founder that focus on blind obedience to the sheikh and these unorthodox beliefs, as proof that they've departed from traditional Islamic thought.
So it's not just about a few, let's say, quirky beliefs. The author seems to be implying that the Naqshbandi teachings could be dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. The author warns that these beliefs could lead followers astray, potentially, undermining their faith and even leading them into practices that go against the core of Islam. He really stresses sticking to the Quran and Sunnah as the ultimate guides for Muslims.
It's like he's saying, don't get swept up in these fancy claims or charismatic figures. Stick to the basics of Islam.
That's a good way to put it. And to really hammer this home, the author uses this interesting analogy. He quotes a Naqshbandi saying that goes, "A friend isn't a true friend until 70 friends testify that he's a heretic."
That's a strange way to define friendship, to say the least. It almost sounds like they're, boasting about being controversial.
It's definitely a weird one, but the author uses it to make a strong point. He's arguing that by the Naqshbandi's own definition, they could be considered heretics because their beliefs and practices are so different from mainstream Islam. It's a bold statement.
It really is.
Yeah.
So in the author's view, the Naqshbandi order is basically off track and could even be a threat to real Islamic faith. That's a pretty serious warning.
It is. It really highlights the importance of thinking critically and having some healthy skepticism when it comes to, religious beliefs and practices.
Hmm.
It reminds us that we shouldn't just accept things blindly, even if it's coming from a seemingly respected source. We need to use our own minds and look for guidance from trustworthy sources to understand things for ourselves.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, that's for sure. We've seen how even within one religion, there can be so many different interpretations and practices, and sometimes that leads to, controversy and even conflict. It's a reminder that searching for spiritual truth is a complex journey, and it's not always easy.
Absolutely. And it's a journey that requires us to be open-minded, but also discerning, always seeking knowledge and understanding, but staying true to the core principles of our faith.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us for this fascinating and sometimes a little unsettling deep dive into the Naqshbandi Sufi order. We hope this has sparked your curiosity and that you'll continue exploring these important topics.